Good morning. It is Friday, June 16th. It is 8:01, and I call the Economic Development Authority special meeting to order. With that, I am looking for a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
Moved by DeLuca.
I'll second.
Second by Francis. Any further discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Motion carries. We'd like to thank everyone for being here and making your schedules, adjusting your schedules and making this work with Monday being a holiday and things going on. We needed to have a Friday morning special meeting. So we have, looking for a motion to approve the minutes.
Minutes. Yeah, I suppose none of them were
Yeah, that
attached.
wasn't attached. I guess we should have taken that off when we
Yeah,
adopted
my
the agenda. I'm
apologies.
sorry. I was going to do that. All right. First item and only item of business is our downtown development, and I will turn that over to staff.
Yeah, thank you, Honorable Mayor, council members, EDA members. Appreciate everybody getting together for this meeting. I'll give a little, I sent out some supplemental information, but I'll give a little background just so you understand why we're here this morning. When we approved we approved as an EDA the ability to allow this development group to move forward and work through a potential project until August 1st of this year. We did that with a couple of things that needed to happen relating to the project, and one of those things was seeking allocation of tax-exempt bonds from the state of Minnesota for an affordable housing project. And so in order to apply for those, to apply for that allocation, there's an application that's due on June 26th, and it's due on or before June 26th. So we have that deadline. Now, the City Council did approve a resolution authorizing the application to be made for the allocation of those bonds, and we did that in May. But as a part of that, there's a significant application fee, there's a deposit required from the developer, and it was intended that we would be able to bring back to the EDA and then ultimately the City Council the financial data that goes along with the project that you reviewed at a conceptual level in March. And so if you remember, if you look at, we included that in the packet, the March meeting, we presented you with just a conceptual site plan and building plan for a 58-unit affordable housing project that corresponded with kind of a pullback in scale of the downtown redevelopment, not including the one existing building that's on that site. And so with that, we intended to be back in front of you, and we just now are in front of you today because we have been trying to put together deal points that we thought at least represented as close as we could get to what the direction of the EDA and council was previously, and trying to bring the best amount of information back to the city for consideration. So we're here today because if you were to move forward with a project, that application would go in on or before the 26th. And actually, there's probably, I mean, it's really tight as we are right now to being able to have the city's bond council complete that application. But there is time if that's what the council directs or the EDA directs, and ultimately council ratifies to do that. But when we brought you that project in March, we always intended to bring you back the financial piece of that with the deal point so you could see the whole deal, understand what that is financially, and then make a decision on whether or not you wanted to move forward. And that was how you approved the conceptual plan in March. And so we want to give you that. When the city received the pro forma from the developer, we noticed something in the pro forma that was not something that we had talked about previously in our consideration of the project, which is why we go through the financial analysis and review all of the information related to the pro forma so we better understand the deal. When we had talked about this deal in March, we talked about it as an affordable housing project where 100% of the units would be affordable. They would meet a certain area median income threshold, so a percentage of area median income, and they would be income qualified. They were required to have a percentage of those affordable in order to seek this allocation from the state for these tax exempt bonds, and then also to apply for tax credits for the project. And those are two pieces, or two different things. So when we had initially then talked about this deal, the valuation of the project, regardless of affordability, so the market value that the tax assessor would place on the project, regardless of affordability, is the same. So if you build an affordable project or you build a market rate project, it has the same valuation. In this case, it's about $11 million in market valuation. What that means to the city typically would be, whether it's affordable or not affordable, it pays the same amount of taxes, or it generates the same amount of taxes. For our purposes, when we talked about this project, we always had a couple of goals in mind. One was to redevelop the site. Two was to put in some significant downtown infrastructure improvements associated with parking, sidewalks, landscaping, utilities, to reinvigorate that block, right? So we were talking about making these improvements on Maple and Main. So in order to do that, one of the things that the city has talked about, we've never gotten to a point where we actually had a formal project, but we've talked about the ability for the city to utilize a portion of the tax increment generated from that property to pay for those improvements, right? So there's tax increment that's generated based on, taxes paid, and the city had hoped, it was always staff's intent, that there would be some revenue generated that would go back to paying the city's portion of those improvements, or paying a portion or all of those improvements, as well as to help the development get off the ground. So to subsidize essentially through that some portion of the project that to close the developer's gap to make this happen. So with that, when we got the pro forma, one of the things we recognized was the taxes that the developer was showing being generated from the project was significantly less than what we would have thought the taxes to be. And so in looking at that, the city's financial consultant, Northland Securities, said they must be looking at some other tax classification or something else. We should figure out what that is. Let's talk about that, because the taxes shown are less than what we would think they'd be. So then when we started talking to the developer, what we determined was, yes, in fact, they were thinking about a different tax classification for these units. And what we then identified was they were intending, through their pro forma, to ultimately enroll 100% of the 58 units as 4D tax classification. And in Minnesota, we have different tax classifications for different property types, and we have different tax classifications associated with things like affordable housing units. Affordable housing doesn't inherently or doesn't automatically mean you would enroll a property in 4D classification. That's a choice that you have to make, and it's something you can ask for if you meet certain affordability criteria. So we reran that. Well, we didn't rerun. We kind of reran from a market rate project, this affordable project, with the 4D classification versus the 4A classification. And 4A is what we would consider just kind of market normal tax rates. And it generates significantly less taxes. And so in doing that, it took what we had thought was a available revenue source that we could utilize to make the city whole and make the developer whole, and it drastically reduced it by 75%. So a pretty significant reduction. So when we found that, we went back and Ted and I talked, and I said, this is no longer a deal that is really worth talking about for the city, because it's not going to accomplish what we want it to accomplish. Now, with that said, if the city's primary goal was to develop an affordable housing project, then that would be something you would talk about, right? A subsidy of sorts that would get a project built. And lots of cities do that. Lots of cities have an underlying goal, or they have EDA has a goal of providing affordable housing units. And so they go out and they try to put these projects together, and it makes sense that way. That wasn't how we had talked about it, and I didn't think that was that's not our primary goal. I think the EDA and council had been clear that affordable, not affordable wasn't really a factor if the project was the right project. We were open to all of that. But it wasn't something that when the taxes generated got compressed by 75%, that didn't look like what we were talking about doing, because the city no longer would have any revenue to pay itself either upfront or pay itself back in the case of our pro forma for the improvements that were being required by the city. And the improvements I'm talking about is in general terms, it's a moving number because you would do a feasibility study and you'd figure all this out. But it's $1.5 million that the city taxpayers will need to invest in the redevelopment of that property. And that is streets, parking, sidewalks, stormwater, sanitary, and water services, right? So in order for that property to really develop, we know the utilities aren't adequate to support it right now. We know the streets need to be redone, the sidewalks need to be redone. We need to figure out some on-street parking solutions, and we want to make it beautiful. So we want to put in our streetscape package and trees and lighting and benches and all the good stuff. So that's about a $1.5 million deal right now. So we went back with the developer and we started talking about them. Are there any other options to make this still work for both sides? And so what we ultimately came to, and we got to this point on Friday night of last week, really in the sense that we got there by saying there was another option. This is what that option looked like. And then legally, we can do that option. And so trying to understand those pieces that came. So that's why we're here now, is we had this kind of gap in what we had anticipated or what we thought maybe was coming through, and then what we're presenting. And in all fairness to the EDA and council, you guys need this information to make a decision on whether or not this is the project you want to move forward with. So I'll walk through those deal points. Scott's here because legally there are some things that come into play with what the terms of this deal present, and those are unique to this deal. They're not the same as if we were to do, like, say, a market rate project where we're just doing a business subsidy agreement and a quote unquote normal TIF district, right? And when we do that, that's really straightforward. Cities do it every day, all day, and we know a lot about it. We've gotten to a point with this deal that there's some unique parameters, and so Scott's here to answer those questions from the legal standpoint. I also want to note, if there are any questions on this tax-exempt bond allocation, if we want to talk about that, Gina Furioni from Kennedy and Graven, who is the bond counsel that we are using on that part of it, is available via phone. I can call her, and she's ready today. So if you guys have questions on that, we can get into that. But I just wanted you to know that she's on standby, because I've had a lot of conversations with her about that piece too, and that piece isn't something you guys talk about a lot, and I know we haven't had tons of conversation other than we approve the resolution. So with that, I just want to walk through this the general deal terms that I put in the packet, and I want to clarify a couple of pieces. There's a couple of clarifying pieces in here, and as I stated, we were doing this Friday. I was trying to update it Monday, and I just trying to make sure I had all the pieces in front of you for consideration. So there's a couple of things that are kind of moving, but I just want to make sure we clarify it, and I'm going to try to go through it the best I can. So the deal that we're talking about, and I'm going to throw it up on the screen just so we can all be clear, is a 58-unit affordable housing project. 100% of the units would be affordable, and 100% of the units would, they'd utilize these housing tax credits, which is a tax credit program that runs through the state, and they have to get approved for that, meaning they still have to get awarded for that. And then they would also seek allocation of tax exempt bonds to finance a good portion of the project. And that allocation comes from the state. It's a competitive allocation, and it's an application-based application that then is awarded. And so even if you today approve, say, this project, or you say we're going to approve it next week or whatever that is, that allocation still has to get awarded to the project, and might not. There's still, it's not a given. It's not a 100%, and then that in and of itself would change or essentially not make the project work. But so project site that we're talking about, highlighted in gray, one of the things that I want to note on this is it doesn't include the existing building piece. It doesn't include the MnDOT piece that the city acquired, or the two MnDOT pieces, and it doesn't include what I'm going to refer to for most of you as Olson's. It does not include that piece of property. In the purchase agreement, there is a PID for it because I was thinking they needed a portion of that property, but right now, in just kind of clarifying that, it doesn't include that. So if we look at the property line, or the proposed properties, you can see on the north side. Let me get my pointer. Let's see if mine works. Yeah.
That would be the area that would be
Oh, got it.
considered for a small retail establishment,
Yep.
essentially?
So Olson's property goes here, up, over to here, and then this angle. So this parking that they're showing on the Olson's piece is actually for this retail piece. They just showed that. So for clarification, this parcel, we would exclude that PID, which is the first PID in the purchase agreement that ends in 6-9. So that's out. This property, which the city owns back here, which we obtained from MnDOT, that's out. And then this little sliver that we have acquired from MnDOT is out. So it's the three parcels that we have in downtown that the city owns. We own, obviously, those other three that I just discussed. But so 58 units, 100% affordable. 2024 construction is what they would be looking for. So you can see that they have a proposed building. It's got underground parking that would be accessed via this parking lot underground here, go underneath the building. They'd have surface parking that would serve it as well. It would be located along Main and Maple, just like they're showing there. And this is an image of the building. This is something we've talked about, looked at a little bit before, but I mean, that's the concept plan that we looked at back in March. It hasn't changed. That's what is being proposed. There's no retail, there's no city hall, and it's 100% a private development building, 3 stories, 58 units. So the deal terms that we've talked about, and I'm going to go through these high-level deal terms, and we can go into any detail. The developer would pay the city $100,000 for acquisition of those, 3 properties. The developer is not asking the city for any tax increment financing with this project at this point for this proposal. So no tax increment is being requested. Now, I'm going to say that, and then I'm going to talk about some other waivers that they're asking. You can look at those waivers however you want to look at those, but essentially you could look at it as there is a ask. You could look at it as they're asking for tax increment because the city could utilize that tax increment to pay itself back for those fee waivers. You could look at it a couple ways, but in essence, on a tax increment, just TIF note, they're not asking for a specific number or allocation from tax increment. Now, I want to say with that the city will still need to establish a tax increment district, and the city will then utilize the proceeds of that tax increment to pay for eligible expenses associated with the redevelopment of this property. So even though the developer's not asking for tax increment, we still create a tax increment district, and we'd still most likely create some sort of a tax increment agreement with the developer. The developer has asked for the fees that are associated with the project to be covered by the city. I put a fee breakdown in the report. That fee breakdown is based on the idea that there are 58 residential equivalent units, or RECs. Now, we haven't done a SAC determination with the Met Council. Ultimately, because we're in Met Council's territory, they do that. That can change that number, but we just used a 1-to-1. Sometimes apartments, if they have in-unit washing machines or not in-unit washing machines, or they have a certain number of floor drains or a wash bay in the basement, or there's different things that could move that a little bit, but we're using 58, so if that number changed, obviously that would be something that we'd look at. But for the city side of this does not include the Met Council's SAC fee, their fee. The city side of sewer access, water access, and park dedication is $437,900 based on those 58 units. The developer has, in negotiations or discussions with the city, we identified that the city council and EDA was not interested in waiving fees. That was one of our points, but in any case, they've offered to pay $100,000 of those fees. So the reduction is $437,900 to $337. So just for round numbers, they would they would ask for a fee waiver for $337,000.
Point of clarification, Ron, is the fee to Met Council, though, they're going to pay, or are they expecting?
Yeah, that isn't our cost. That would be their cost.
Met Council will not waive that fee.
Correct. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, and we have no authority over that fee or anything really to do with that fee.
Another point of clarification, this $100,000 that they are proposing to pay, is that in lieu of or in addition to the purchase price of the property?
In addition to.
Okay. Another point of clarification. Park dedication fee, according to our fee schedule, can range from a minimum of $3,750 up to a maximum of $8,000.
Correct.
Why did we use $3,750 or $3,750?
It's what we used on the last project that we did that was multifamily like this. It doesn't mean that we have to use that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next point of clarification, stormwater. In the stormwater and then the public improvement piece kind of goes hand in hand, but the city, in talking about this project initially, and the developer talking about this project, was concerned about stormwater being provided on site. And we had originally talked about utilizing the MnDOT piece of property for potentially providing on-site stormwater. But if you think about kind of all the master planning we've talked about in the downtown area, and then you think about it downtown, having an open water body or a pond of some kind of your marquee intersection, it just doesn't seem like that's the fit that the city would want. And it takes up valuable land. We only have so much land. We talked about having, public space or public plaza space in some fashion or format. So we've talked about trying to get stormwater off this site so that we don't have a big pond on a big piece of the property there. And so in talking about that, we've talked about the idea that if we're doing public improvements, we could look at ways to accommodate either regional, what I'd call regional ponding, meaning it would accommodate more than just one property. So we'd look at how do we build ponding somewhere downstream where we can accommodate some of the redevelopment projects, not maybe just this one, but and then also the city is going to have some stormwater ponding requirements when we redo our roads. So how and where do we accommodate that? So we talked about that. A lot of cities have regional ponding for their downtowns, or they have a stormwater district that's created for certain areas that builds then a regional infrastructure, and then there's a plug-in, just like our sewer or our water system. And cities also do charge fees associated with that, right? So they charge a stormwater fee, a stormwater access fee. In this case, a developer is asking for the city to provide basically that plug-in so that they don't have any on-site stormwater, and then they're asking for that as a part of the ask or a part of the deal points that we're talking about. The city does not have a cost associated with that. I know the city engineer has looked at it.
One of the things I think we didn't quite hit is you asked about the fees at number one, or our development group is, it's the $100,000 purchase price, it's $100,000 for the city fees, but then it's also $300,000 for infrastructure, so we're paying that.
I'm getting there.
Yeah, we're gonna let staff finish.
Okay.
And then.
Yeah, I'm
when it's
getting there.
appropriate, you'll be
On that.
invited to the podium. We can't have people
Thanks.
speaking from the floor without coming forward.
So there's this stormwater piece that we haven't fully identified costs, right? So I just want to be clear, for the city standpoint, we don't know the cost of that system yet. Bolton Mink has looked at it. They have said they think they can accommodate regional stormwater through the redevelopment of our streets and infrastructure. But we don't know what that is. So, but the developer is, I mean, we're talking about, their ask is no stormwater fee to plug into that system.
Point of clarification. Bolton and Mink is looking into it,
Yes.
so we have an idea where this regional location might be?
They have identified, or what Dave and I have talked about is he thinks we can do it. And he thinks we can do it within the kind of downtown area. So that's as much as they've looked at, and, you know, they haven't, I mean, I think they've done some, what I would call pretty decent feasibility of that, but obviously nothing that you've seen, nothing in writing, we don't know what the cost is.
Did the developer ask us to take the stormwater piece, or did staff suggest that?
Well, I think we suggested we don't want a pond on the site, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it would be on the city's piece, right? I mean, that we just said, do you want a pond in the corner of your downtown, you know, an open stormwater system right in downtown? And I think the answer from staff level is one, it's a lot of property, and we might be able to use that for other stuff, and two, there's probably a better regional solution, but it's not the only solution, right? We can put stormwater in a lot of places. But this site may have limitations because of high groundwater. We don't exactly know what's there. So we don't know, can it accommodate below ground stormwater? Can it accommodate BMP type stormwater measures that would be things that would, you know, potentially allow or take the stormwater? So I think our recommendation would be, let's look at how do we do offsite. I don't know that we, you know, the conversation on the cost, and I'll talk about this 300,000. So kind of hand in hand with public improvements, we have talked before in past deals. So when we were talking to Ebert, and then when we were talking to this group previously, we've talked about the group paying a assessment. So for the street and utilities and all of that, we had talked about paying, the developer paying an assessment. They agree to pay this upfront assessment for public infrastructure. And the number that we've used is 300,000. That represents 20% of the total cost. And that's how we've gotten to that 300,000. That's just a number. There's nothing specifically magic about that, other than if we get to 20% of the project being assessed, it opens up different ways that you guys can finance those improvements. So if you have an assessment project, you're able to use general obligation bonds because 20% of the project is accessible. So that's how we got to that.
And this question would be both planning and legal. In your narrative and what you just said, you said that the city shall be responsible for designing and maintaining stormwater management system. But in the purchase agreement on page 16, it says, the developer shall be responsible for designing and maintaining stormwater management system to the satisfaction of the city. What is it?
So it's a clarification. The city is going to provide a plug-in for stormwater, but there's still stormwater that has to be designed and handled on site. So that would be the responsibility, and that might mean that need to be the clarification is they're going to have stormwater piping in their parking lot for their building. for the roof drains, for all of that, that's got to be designed and handled by the developer to then get to the city system. And I don't know, Scott, you and I are trying to get this all put together. I don't know if we clarified that enough or.
I mean, the provisions I put in there from the, deal points that were provided to me.
Yeah.
I will say that anything on site is the developer's responsibility until it hits into the city's system, similar to, so even if we had a development that was a housing development and there was a ponding system that it was, they have to put the system together to collect the water, but say if it runs through a pond that's into another development or to a city pond site, that's then outside that responsibility.
Okay, but I spent 3 years on the Pioneer Sarah Creek watershed,
Mhm.
and I know the fees and the engineering costs associated with designing and the application process and the approval and the whole 9 yards is outside of just the raw cost of building this. Is that?
That's their
That's
cost.
gonna be the city's responsibility?
They're going to have to get a permit.
Okay.
But the only difference is part of their stormwater plan that they'll create is going to show that they are plugging into a regional pond, and then the city will have the corresponding documentation that says that regional pond can accommodate and meets the rest of the requirements of the watershed and of the city. But to your point, the developer is going to have to create that plan, not for the regional pond, but for their site, and then there's still all kinds of erosion control, SWIP, all kinds of other things associated. That's all going to be a part of their package. The difference here is the rate and quality controls that are the stormwater pieces are going to be handled on an off-site system. And it very much is what I call plug and play. So we literally will provide a sewer pipe that stormwater pipe that plugs into their property. Everything that they take and put into that has to be documented and whatever. But once it gets to that, then it would be the city, and it's going to alleviate this. It's going to alleviate the storage capacity that is needed otherwise on a site. The regional ponding thing is fairly common. The only piece of it I don't have for you, I can't tell you, is what are you actually giving, because I don't know what that cost is. And most cities, not most, every city that does regional ponding has a regional ponding, a stormwater access charge, right? I mean, it's just like our sewer. We decide how much did it cost to build, what's the benefiting properties, and what's the allocation to those properties, and then what does that cost?
I guess my question is, if we put a stormwater retention pond on that MnDOT property, would it look very similar to that retention pond that's east of Maple Plain? A pond with the riprap and the
Haven
security
Homes?
fence around it on Highway 12. There's a retention
Oh,
pond.
Just past
where the
Baker
park
Park Road.
where the park district is,
Yeah,
that one.
there's a retention pond there.
Oh, I know the one you're talking about. Yeah.
You'd have to put a fence around it, right?
If it's right in
And
downtown
erosion-
is our concern.
And erosion control.
Yeah.
Don't know if that's something I'm looking forward to in downtown Maple Plain.
Which is why we're trying to go off-site. We're trying to go down the road somewhere, back a house not seen that would not take up that land. So $300,000 is what the developer would pay the city up front for public infrastructure. So it'd be a payment in lieu of an assessment.
But if 20% is this hypothetical number, if the bill for improvements reach $2.5 million because of the fact that this regional ponding and stuff now requires us to go, let's say, behind the fire hall,
Right.
is it 20% of 2.5 million, or is it still $300,000?
We've talked about a flat number of $300,000.
Okay.
Kind of last then deal point, which is the biggest piece that we had identified in this, and the most unique to what we're talking about in this project, is this 4D tax classification. And so the 4D tax classification is a tax classification that can apply to properties that are affordable and meet affordability criteria. And that is something that is sought annually by the property owner. Now, in certain size cities, if the tax amount exceeds a percentage of overall total taxes of the city, total tax revenue of the city does have some say in that, but that's not this project. So this can be applied for by the developer annually, or the owner of the property annually, to seek this 4D classification. I do want to say, in the 4D classification, in the last 30 days, it went from a tax valuation it used to be for the first $100,000 of market valuation, there was a tax applied at a 0.75 rate to the first 100, and then after that it went to 0.25. Well, in the last legislative session, that got compressed, or that got reduced, and now it's just 0.25% across the board. And that happened on May 23rd. I think I put the date in there, which was right about the time we were starting to run a pro forma with the 4D, and it made that bad pro forma I talked about even worse because the state decided that 4D needed to be even lower. So I just point that out because literally this was happening this month. Or this past month. But with that, they're seeking the ability to enroll the property in 4D classification for the first 17 years that the property is in existence. And why that's important is, if we were to do a project, and again, our goal is to try to make the city as whole as possible, right? I mean, we want a project that works well for the city, redevelops that block, but also makes the city whole on what the taxpayers are being asked to expend. With that project, then we're going to put TIF. We're going to do a tax increment district, and the tax increment is what is going to pay the city back. And so, any of the deals we've talked about in the last 2 years, and I'm only going to say the last couple of years, the way that our financial person, Tammy, who does a really great job on this, the way that we structured these deals and what the developers were asking for is that the city provide tax increment, or a large percentage of the total tax increment generated upfront in the first, say, 15 years of a project, and then the city would capture the back end years of the tax increment generated, say years 15 through 26, and these are 26-year districts. And so that's how we were looking at the structure. What that means to the city is that you would bond for the project, you would issue debt, taxpayers would be paying for that, but then on the back end of that project, after 15 years, the developer no longer gets tax increment and the city gets all of it, and you would have created this fund for the city that would be a debt that you would then say, but we're going to repay ourselves for that debt. So you would bookmark this as debt on your books that is part of this TIF fund, and then you would back end pay yourself back, and then you'd get the money back. That doesn't change that you'd still issue the debt and you'd still have the liability for those first 15 years. But in essence, you'd get made whole at some point in that project. The other piece of that is, I always think beyond 26 years, you're going to have this property in your town. So what does this property do long term for the city in terms of tax generation? So with this 4D classification, the developer and the city came to this idea that by agreement, through an agreement, you could limit the number of years that they sought 4D tax classification. And if you were able to do that, and that's what we had to figure out, could we legally even do this through an agreement? If we were able to do that, then at year 18, conceivably, the city could then collect what would be considered 4A taxes on the project. And remember, whether it's a market rate or an affordable housing, it has the same valuation. So, we're still talking that then this would be an $11 million project or whatever it is in year 17. And so in year 18, we would, instead of collecting $24,000 in taxes, and I can show you this, annually, we would collect $204,000. So in years 18 through 26, we would collect $200,000 a year instead of 24. That tax increment is what we would be able to then pay the city back with. And I'll show you the tip run. It's in the packet. I'll show you how that breaks down. But just in general terms then, through this agreement that we'd have to put in place, we would have to make sure that then the project doesn't apply for 4D tax classification in years 18 through 26. And by agreement, the city has the ability to go out 30 years on an agreement, but that's the max. We can do it. And so we've suggested, Scott and I talked, and Tammy and I talked, and I've suggested that it would just be for the remainder of the 30-year life of that agreement, that the developer could not seek 4D classification.
So year 31, they could apply for 4D classification?
Year 31, it could apply for 4D tax classification. Now, I will tell you with affordable housing projects, and this isn't a absolute, but I mean, I think people probably generally recognize that if you have an affordable housing project, it's probably going to be an affordable housing project forever. I mean, they don't often go back to market rate projects, but that doesn't mean they can't. They just don't often convert like that.
Mark, before we get too far, we're throwing around 4A and 4D. Sounds like you got caught by surprise looking at the pro forma that you had been thinking 4A and they were thinking 4D. Can you give us maybe everyone else already knows, can you give a 10,000-foot overview of what 4A is and what 4D is?
Yeah, I wish I knew better, but so the state has tax classifications for all types of properties, and I had a definition up on it and I closed it.
I liked how he said 4A is market normal. Like,
Yeah.
you know, just
So it is a tax classification that applies to low income or the affordable housing. They call it low income in the state literature, but it's a certain percent AMI, but it's an affordable housing tax rate. And it is intended to allow those units to be more affordable. And so if a project qualifies, meaning that they're income restricted and meet these classifications, then they can go from what would be 4A normal tax rate for multifamily residential property to 4D, which is a low-income qualifying tax rate.
But the 4D classification has no particular bearing necessarily on the city. It is to the advantage of the developer because they're able to capture a larger rebate or...
Not a
tax-
rebate, it's just, they just have less tax bill for that property. So they pay less taxes, they don't get it back. This is just a straight up reduction in taxes.
so there is an implication.
Okay.
And if I'm reading the Minnesota Department of Revenue information correctly, it's 0.75.
Well, now it's 0.25.
Is it 0.2? Well, I see it.
So it was 0.75, and that
Now
was
it's
the big
0.25.
compression. Well, and it was 0.75 for the first 100,000.
Yeah,
So
now it's across the board.
Yeah.
it was low. I mean, even before the May 23rd bill, it was low. It's significantly lower than what a 4A classification pays in taxes. And those numbers that I just told you, 25,000 to 200,000 on a $11 million valuation. That's what you're talking about. So that means for the developer, and I mean it makes sense for an affordable housing project to seek 4D classification because they pay 75% less taxes. I mean, ballpark. And then, but that means the city, the school district, the county all generate 75% less taxes, which is fine in and of itself. But for the city, we were looking at, do we have TIF revenue to pay ourselves back or pay for a portion of our investment? That's the difference.
This system then, Mark, would allow from years 18 to 30 that we could capture those because the developer by agreement would not seek that classification.
That's correct.
What's the enforceability of that, or maybe that gets to
Well, that's
Scott's
why
mindset.
that's why
Say none
Scott's
of us
here.
might be at the table in 18 years.
I'll be drinking
Every 2
eating from a
years.
straw in 18 years.
Oh,
Just in case anybody wants to know, it's 2043.
Yeah.
oh, easy.
John, be
That's even
careful,
worse.
youngster.
All right, let's let Mr. Landsman.
So, I mean, so the question is, the biggest part of it is that what we're talking about is entering into an agreement or contract with the developer or property owner so that they're allowed this 4D classification to a certain point, and then after that, they'll agree not to make application, then we revert back to the 4A. That's what we're talking about. And so it's a pure contractual claim. And with a contractual claim, our remedies are contractual, meaning that if they don't follow through, then we have to bring a lawsuit to enforce the contract. And as you probably know, civil lawsuits are not quick, you know, and they can be costly. But if we did prevail, we'd seek for some sort of injunctive relief or declaratory relief from the courts, changing the classification back to 4A, and maybe and looking for recovery of the lost tax revenue. This, because it's a contract claim and we'd be the plaintiff, it's highly unlikely that it would have lead coverage. Highly unlikely. So that's the enforcement issue in that part. Another part too, and Mark and I talked about this and where he got 30 years from, there is the 30-year law where restrictions on the use of property, like covenants, declarations like we're talking about here, agreements and terms, have a 30-year life. There are some exceptions to it. But generally, once that's gone, then any restrictions or rights that the city would have under the agreement for enforceability are most likely going to disappear. So, meaning, as Mark noted, and I think it was recognized by the council, then whatever classification they want to go for, it's their choice. So hopefully that helps answer the questions.
And I just want the council and EDA to understand it because this is not normal. I asked our bond counsel. She said she's never seen this deal. I asked Tammy Umdahl, she's been around forever on these deals, and that's no offense, Tammy. But she's super smart. I asked her, she said she's never seen it. But that's how we got to this, is we talked about this idea. So it's not that it can't be done, it's that nobody's done it, but we do have, there are concerns about it because of what Scott raised. Somebody's got to remember it, that in year 17, this deal goes away. Somebody's got to then make sure that it's enforced in year 18. And then if there's a change in ownership or there's a different group or there's question as to what would it take to enforce that. And then, what does that look like?
And Mark, I should say, there are also some concerns out there from when we had some conversations on this. One, this kind of deal, would it be acceptable to their financing and the developers' financing and the developers, the deal that they're trying to work through, and could they make it work? And number two, as projects move on, you get subsequent owners, you get subsequent financing. In commercial deals that I've worked on, when we've had city agreements, what the lenders are looking for is subordination of agreements. So if you have if we allow the subordination to happen, and then there's a foreclosure, then it's wiped out. That's a concern too. Not saying it's going to happen, but these are those to me are secondary issues over the enforceability. And the fact that it goes away after 30 years.
Can you clarify that? It doesn't follow the property. If there's a foreclosure, the agreement is null and void.
Because in Minnesota, you have, those items that are recorded first have priority. So right now, our agreement would have priority, but if we subordinated it to a new lender, if that's what we did, then we'd be junior, and if it was a foreclosure, all junior liens are wiped out. And I will say that I have seen in, not this type of project, but I have seen in other larger development projects, not at market rate at least, where the lenders are looking for subordination, and it's a determination of the city. Because part of it too is that if the city doesn't subordinate, you could end up with a project that doesn't survive. And so the city has to weigh that. At that point, I'm not saying you have to subordinate, but it's going to be, at some point, it possibly could come up. But that's why I'm saying it's secondary to the first two issues, simply because it's a possibility where I would see enforcement and the reversionary or the 30-year law as something that's more concrete.
And our point is, you just need to know that and then
Yeah.
factor that into your decision. I think it's important. It's unique to this project. It's not something we've looked at before. So there are some risks associated with it in the sense that, if you're looking for that repayment. Now, you've already paid the bonds, you've already paid the debt by that point, if that's the case. So the liability is that you just wouldn't generate the same amount of taxes that would be used to pay yourself back. And just in clarification of that, the way that you would structure this is you would issue bonds to pay for this. It would be general obligation bonds, and the city taxpayers would be on the hook to pay those. In year 17, you would start in year 1, and I'll go through this table, you'll start generating tax increment. But you're not going to generate enough to pay your debt service. And so in year 18, you're going to start generating more revenue, and you're going to pay yourself back. That is Tammy and I were talking about this. Those that return on that, or the money that you generate when you go to pay yourself back, it's not restricted money. So just for the council, that means you can use it for anything. So once you pay yourself back, it's just general fund money. It's not. So it is, in that sense, it's pretty open to the city. You can do whatever you want. But I know this in your packet. I know it's hard to see, but so just looking at it, this is the kind of analysis that gets done. So the city would issue debt for the project, and the debt service payments that you would make would be these payments here, so you can see how those payments are. And then this column E is what the city has available in TIF from the project to make those payments. So then the net of that is this city levy. So you would have to levy this amount, and you can see that amount goes through 2042, which is year 17, and you would be making that those payments. This is the tax impact, which has always been the same, right? This project doesn't change what your bond amount is, and it doesn't change then what the impact is to the taxpayers. But what happens in year 17 on this deal is that then year 18, you get to the TIF generated down here. And that corresponds, you can see it's not direct, but that corresponds to the taxes paid for the property. So this column B is what the developer would pay in taxes based on the estimated market value over here for the county. So this column shows you that in the first, couple of years, obviously when it's not built or not fully built, but this is that 4D classification, and then that's your 4A classification. So you can see the significance of that. That's the easiest way for me to see it, is just what that represents. But on this deal, what you see kind of from the total finance piece down here is project costs of 1.5. That's what you're gonna have in costs, less the special assessments from the development. That's the 300, less the land proceeds. So the city infrastructure project cost finance is 1.1 million. capitalized interest, par amount of the bonds, term of the bonds at 25 years, issue in 24. This is that 300, which is still there. And then if we go, I'm going to jump through this, but it's really then down here, that's your tax levy, that's your fees waived. So if you add those up, that's the total TIF that you would reimburse yourself for. And if you look at the total TIF generated, there is the potential that you could have more TIF than what you need to reimburse yourself. So if you look at that you would end that district early potentially if that was the case. You paid yourself back for the TIF that was obligated on the debt that was obligated on the project. That's what I've got on this. So, the city started out on this project looking at it as an affordable housing, 58 units. It's what we call kind of a compressed project from where we had, looked at obviously before. I think the one thing that I've kind of talked about with the city, this is kind of a marquee block for the city. It's your downtown, primary block. This needs to be a catalyst project, meaning it's got to be done well so that it causes for other people to want to redevelop. The city needs to do something there in order to cause other development to occur. We need to put in streetscape. We need to put in utilities that support this type of development. So does it check all those boxes? And then long term, what does the city, want to see on that property? This is one option that the city has that I think is based on this is viable, but the city has to decide the fees being asked, the contribution of the developer to the project, is that all line up or make sense for the city? And then are the risks associated with this deal versus different deals? Is that what you want? And then I will say, just on the affordability piece, we've talked about affordability, not affordability, and that's something that obviously is up to the EDA and council and what you want to have ultimately in your city. This particular deal would be 100% affordable, and it would utilize. It would require that the project get allocated for the tax exempt bonds. It would require that the project get allocated for the tax credit program, and then it would require that the developer is able to classify the 100% of the units at 4D tax classification in order to make that work. So, be happy to answer any questions. The developer's obviously here as well. So,
All right, questions for staff? More questions, I guess. We've kind of interacted a little bit. Anyone have any questions for the developer?
It's a lot to digest.
Mayor, I have a couple of thoughts. Up until today, we really had never seen the terms of this agreement.
correct.
And I think we gave pretty clear direction to the previous administrator as to what we were looking for as an EDA, and the council provided that to her as well. I am personally fully supportive of affordable housing. I'm supportive of market-priced units. It's what makes sense to go in over there, and I appreciate the work the developer has done. I'm troubled by a couple of things. I'm troubled by the water, sewer, and park fees. I'm not interested in reducing those fees, and I thought we were crystal clear with staff that we would not take a reduction in those. It's $250,000 that the city is not obtaining. Stormwater is an intriguing issue. Here again, I'm not interested in subsidizing, and I don't know why staff would have in any way, any fashion, said that the developer would not be responsible for paying for that. If that happened, that was a mistake by staff. Developer creates the need for stormwater. They need to figure that out. It's a cost of doing business. I'm supportive of the regional ponding idea, but only if we had a sense of what that was, by your own admission, Mark, you go, I don't know what it is. You know, and if it built into this deal had been some line item about, well, here's our share of the ponding that we would have done on site that will contribute to a regional ponding system, fine, you have my support. The public improvement piece causes me a ton of anxieties. 20% was mentioned as the substitute for the assessment. Keep in mind, folks, we're going to be sitting here this fall with another road project where we're going to have the public packed in this audience when we're assessing our standard 35% assessment. So if this property had been the owner of this property and we did a road project, we would be assessing 35%. You can do the math in your head. That's a substantial difference, and one that I don't know how you explain to the resident who says, why are you taxing me 35 when you had a big developer that you essentially did a substitute assessment and did 20 on? The complexity of the 18 years, I finally got my arms around last night, this 4ADB. Great, if the developer wants to find available lower taxes, great, and I appreciate the fact that in year 18, the developer's willing to come back and say, well, we won't apply for that. Is it a risk? Yeah, because none of us are probably going to be here in 18 years. I appreciate the fact that it's got to be documented, but I'd be supportive of that if we could have a well-documented agreement, and I maybe overly trust people that if you say you're going to do something on year 18, you will. However, I also thought last night, you know, what happens in that building in 18 years? You have an 18-year-old building that's going to need a new roof, maintenance, and those things at the very time that you're going to say to them, based on the numbers that Mark put, your cost just went up from $20,000 to over $200,000 at the very time when they're going to want to do repairs on that building. Thus, for me, in order to make this work from my lens and my one vote, I'd need to see this deal restruck in a way that has the water, sewer, and park dedication fees paid, that the stormwater plan assumes the responsibility for the portion of the stormwater they would create, even if it's a part of a regional system. The assessment percentage must match what we're going to be assessing our very own residents. And I'd like to see Scott with a well-documented agreement to limit the complexity of the downtown or the 18-year long-term problem. I don't want to saddle a future council with a problem and they look back and go, what was that council thinking in 2023? In the absence of those, I will vote to recommend to council we do not proceed with this. That's what it would take to get me on board.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I guess I'll chime in with my thought that, you know, when we started this 18 years ago, we had this vision of what the downtown was going to look like, and where we were going to start. This would be our cornerstone. And that vision has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and the risk has gone. And I think, John, you said this last time I was here, basically, and our risks have gone up and up and up and up. And I feel very uncomfortable moving forward with this the way it is, just on that one. And the second thing on a greed point, you know, I look at how much Burgess and Caswell is going to be paying in taxes to finance this, and what's the value that the commercial businesses are going to be getting for that $400 per year to start with. If I read that chart right, because residential was one price and commercial industrial was another, and so it's going to cost our people that are the cornerstone that's pay the most taxes already.
Well, but you'll get that back.
remember? In year 18, we started to
Remember,
pay
you're gonna be
ourselves
sucking
back.
tea, you're gonna be sucking tea through a straw.
I won't be at this table.
And one more thing I do want to throw in is that when we have these agreements, and someone has to remember what's gonna happen in 18 years, I see some of the documentation that we did and things we did for the EDA because of the turnover and the city manager, some of those records are lost. You know, is this agreement that in 18 years we have a right to renegotiate, is that gonna come to fruition? That would be the biggest, scariest thing if we did decide to move this forward. So,
I should say it's one issue. I mean, any document we have obviously is going to be recorded, but I think the issue
Someone
is
has to
just,
read it.
right, the issue is management and oversight. And even, I'll put it this way, it doesn't matter the size of the city, 18 years is a long time. And you're going to have turnover in both administration and council, people who don't remember it. And so in some respects, and who knows, in computer systems. But in some respects, you're kind of relying on the developer or the property owner to follow suit. Mike, this is where you're talking about the trusting of people. So, but you are correct with regard to that part.
Commissioner Fay?
I might be a little more critical than most, but, and Mark, this is not critical on you. You've done yeoman's work in trying to keep this thing afloat, but I see too many pieces that continually move, and the chessboard is all over, and I'm just uncomfortable with it. I said some time ago, and this is not a slam on low or moderate income or affordable housing, but I don't know if we need 58 units of affordable housing in our premier location, downtown Maple Plain. We have scores of units, whether it be Bryantwood, whether it be Manchester, that are essentially affordable, where those apartment owners are not getting tax incentives. I mean, the developers seem to have found a way in order to maximize. You've seen the pro forma. Why haven't we seen the pro forma? Why haven't we seen, here's our investment, here's how we're doing it, here's our rents, here's our tax credits, here's our taxes, and here's our rate of return, you know, and clearly it was a conscious decision on their behalf to go into this 4D classification. Surprise! So I am even with the modifications of terms that would add more SACWAC and park, that would, this $1.5 million with this regional ponding system is a pipe dream. It's not 1.5. It's going to be considerably more, and we're going to be on the hook for that. I'm not in favor of proceeding.
Other thoughts?
I concur with everything that's been said. Just, I think the city's too much on the hook, and we're risking our residents.
I'm totally agreeant with that statement.
Okay. Anything else from staff?
No, I mean, so I suppose, Scott, I mean, it would be good if the EDA made a formal recommendation to the council if that was the case, so that, I mean, they need to know which is why we're here, to try to figure this out before the application goes.
And Mr. Schmidt, the developer, is here today. Did you have anything? I know I cut you off earlier from the floor. It was,
No, it's my time, and I'd like to speak.
all right. Please come to the podium.
I don't need it, Yeah.
So, how Lumber One got here is we were looking at a project about a year ago on this site, brought to us by Marty. And it was a redevelopment area, blighted area. And it resonated very similar to a project I'm doing on Highway 12 down in Wilmer. So this is construction picture. We're 90% of the way done with this project. And that's what it's looking like now. It's not done painted, balconies aren't on, but that's what it looks like right now. That's what it used to look like. That blue Quonset hut. It also had $600,000 worth of soil cleanup. So Wilmer was in very much a similar situation as Maple Plain is. They created a Renaissance district, and we took 11 different parcels and we're making, that had $600,000 worth of cleanup on it, and it's looking like that. And in 30 more days, it's gonna be green grass and balconies on. The pergola will be on top and the light. So, yes, they also took some risks. A couple things, we got so many numbers going involved. With doing the 4D classification, the city is going to actually have, in the first 20 years, gonna have almost $300,000 more cash into this deal than they would have if we went at market rate with TIF, because I would have been getting the captured tax capacity. In the 4D situation, your city's getting 100% of tax capacity. So if you Mark runs the numbers for the first 20 years, including the $300,000 fee I'm paying, you're gonna end up, at the first 20 years, you're gonna have $300,000 more cash in the bank than you would have under the market rate that we were with Marty presenting a year ago. The performers have been, Mark, I've sent,
Yeah.
every performer has been
We have the
coming.
performance, so, yeah.
The 4D, that's not a bait and switch. The city, or not, the state changed that guideline, and when the rates went down that low under the 4D, it makes it so that it's actually it's not an advantage for me to ask for TIF anymore. It actually is a disadvantage. My cash flow going if we stay market rate, my cash flow on this, and we looked at this, is $20,000 a year less if we go market rate, and you're gonna get the city would be receiving $300,000 less money over the first first 20 years, then everything balances out. So we ran through a lot, too many numbers, and it's starting to get confusing. This is actually a better situation for the city and a better situation for us. The next thing we got down in this rabbit hole of what ifs at year 18. At year 18, I'm gonna have 3.6 million upfront into this. I'm gonna have, my tax credits are paid off, so that's $5 million worth of equity that I'll have at year 18. And I'll have about $2 million worth of principal paid off on my long-term debt. So I'm gonna have about $10 million worth of equity, or our group is. Why would I ever let this thing go to save $1.2 million or whatever on taxes at that point? I mean, that would be the poorest decision of this group that we could possibly do. I mean, why would you give up $10 million so that I don't have to pay $1.2 million worth of taxes? That doesn't make any sense. I'm not sure if any of you went on our website and looked at Lumber One, what we built over the last 20 years. This is what we do. The other equity position is Greg Winfeld. He has a really long history of multifamily housing, very strong business, PCI, with over 400 employees in the St. Cloud area. He needs a rate of return. I mean, he's not getting a general contractor fee, he's not a property manager, he has a small minority interest in property management, but that's not what's driving it. He needs a cash-on-cash return. With going market rate, he's better off buying a CD. This doesn't, when you look at the performa, why are you gonna put this kind of effort in for $40,000, $50,000 worth of cash flow? Which is what, I mean, we've been looking at this for a long time. So there's not an incentive there for the investor group that's coming in involved in this. Then I think the other part we're losing is, we keep labeling it as low income or what this county means is $75,000 a year job. That's what this qualifies for in this project.
I do have a question on that. Is that just, let's say that two people are living there that have two jobs, and each one is 75,000, would they qualify for this?
They'd be over income qualified.
They would be over?
Yes.
Okay, so it's one total income for the residents of 75,000.
And it's, the breakdown is by number of persons in the family, unit.
Okay, so if there were 4 people,
Then that income threshold changes.
It's lower.
Goes higher. There's one person goes lower.
Yeah.
And again, that gets adjusted every year by the state, so it's not a static thing, so it's not 75 this year, and we got year 18 at 75. So that,
Okay.
that slide will move up as this ages. Once one person's in there, if their income increases, we can't evict them. So if they start there and they're making 68,000, they get 2 promotions, they make 120,000 3 years from now, it's not, we don't evict them. So they can grow in that building and not be blown out of the program. They have to qualify on the front side. So again, get someone in, you can move up. So the city concessions, that has been on the table since I've been here. And in fact, the $100,000 that we're offering is something that was never asked of me in any prior meeting. But if we go back to the original minutes, it's always been that city concessions on those fees. So this is not, that's not a new ask. I've never asked that. In fact, Mark has negotiated me $100,000 by, when we said, let's go with the 4D. He said, well, the city's not gonna agree to the full $350,000 worth of concession, Ted, you're gonna have to give something. So I said, well, let's present $100,000. That's how that came up. The last item we were talking about, and this is a really important one, is if I'm paying that $300,000 up front for the storm water, I need to be able to connect on to something. In the performer that you'll see, I have a $300,000 fee in it that I'm paying the city. I also have a $300,000 construction cost for stormwater that's blowing me outside the area that this project works for us. So either I build an on-site storm pond, then we gotta waive that storm fee because you're not providing me any stormwater services, or I get stormwater service pipe to my site, and then I don't have that at $300,000. So one of the $300,000 numbers has to go one way or the other. So if you say, I don't think that's regional pond's ever gonna happen, then I need to put a storm pond on here with surface drainage to get to that pond, or we need a pipe. Gotta do one or the other. That's it. That's I'm open for questions. But if we wanna make that site look, I'm not sure if the last time you guys have been over there.
Mr. Schmidt, thank you for being
Yeah.
here. And we have no question about the quality work that your company, Lumber One, does, or what you are doing. But it is our job as electeds and appointed from the city to represent all of our residents and business owners and to make decisions looking forward. And it is this board's duty to make a recommendation. So at this time, I'm asking for a recommendation from the, officially from the EDA to the council.
Point of clarification. I am not in favor of pursuing. Can I make a motion not to enter into this purchase agreement and which would set in motion the application for the bonding or the taxing component? How do I phrase a motion that is against what this packet is asking for?
We don't necessarily need an emotion, but we need
Well,
a
Mark said,
recommendation.
Yeah, I would
Well,
say.
that has to happen at council, right? Or does it need to
I
happen
would,
here?
well, Scott, you.
No, you would make it would be a motion with a second on a recommendation to the city council not to enter into the purchase agreement.
Then I will make a motion to forward to the city council, and the recommendation would be not to pursue the purchase agreement.
Right, we have a motion by Commissioner Fay.
I'll second that motion.
Second by Commissioner Burak. Any further discussion?
I would add that I will be supporting this motion, but I do believe that if you were to work with staff on cleaning up some of the issues that I mentioned in my suggestions, I think there may be more receptiveness to doing that. You've just taken too much from the city and provided too much risk for the city in the long run that I don't want to strap an 18-year council down the road. And we have nothing, we're getting very little by way of our fees, our structure, what we're being asked to put into this. It's too big of an ask.
I would agree with that, the risk and liability of taxpayer expense. I can't do in good conscience. All right, so with that, we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. All right, so the recommendation will go forward to council then. Is there anything else we need to do, staff, at this time?
I guess what he was just talking about on, actually with what they're proposing would have a better, less impact on the city. I don't think we all understand that, and maybe we need to spend one session, analyzing what happens when we go into these different agreements on, the bonding, et cetera. Because he his comment was that we would net more income going with this procedure, right?
Yeah.
And
This way,
I don't think any of us, I think we need more knowledge.
Yeah, Chair and EDA members, I do think it would be good if we would invite Tammy to come out and do a session with the EDA, because it is complex, and what he's saying, I mean, Ted and I have gone around on this, and I'm looking at all these numbers, and Tammy does a bunch of numbers, and we have all the pro formas, right? But what we do, the reason, so the developer typically provides a pro forma, and then we ask our financial people to break down that pro forma. They use their own tax rates based on what they think it is. They use some other assumptions, and then Northland uses their own assumptions. So when you line them up, they don't look exactly the same, and it gets confusing that way. But we look at their return and say, is that within what would be considered market or normal, right? And so, but we don't get into the, like, it's 6.2% or something, it should be 6.1, or, we don't get that minute, but the deal terms, in terms of what it represents to the city, so taxes generated, what Ted was alluding to is, under the last deal we had looked at, when it was a market rate deal, the developer's getting 90% or 95% of the TIF up front. So when you're looking at years 1 through 15, that generates maybe a little bit less than the 24,000 that we showed you, right? So he's adding up that 24 times 15 years gets to 300.
But remember, that was also an $18 million project. This
Right,
is an
so
$11
that's why I'm
million
saying,
project.
but that's why I'm saying maybe we could come in and just show you kind of how these things look and what we look at, so you could get a better handle, because I think that'd be
So,
important for you.
I think what I'm hearing is their agreement that we could all learn and would like to learn more. So can staff look into inviting the appropriate people
Yes.
to do that on July 10th at our next EDA?
Yes.
meeting? Thank you. All right. With that, is there any other business? I just truly, again, want to thank everyone for rearranging their schedules
appreciate
and
that.
making this happen with that 26th deadline. We needed to do that. So true appreciation for that. With that, looking for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved by Henrik,
Second.
second by Francis. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. All right, the meeting's adjourned at 9:26.